Hello and welcome to another video. In today's video we're going to be trying to solve a problem that we found on our Bolens HT20 when we were recently replacing the front tyres, which if I do this you can see quite well. We've had plenty of use out of this tractor so far this year as our main grass cutting tractor. Now it wouldn't normally be, usually that duty falls on one of our Bolens HT23s. However, at the start of the grass cutting season that was running quite rough, so we investigated and we found out that it had a cracked head on one side, so we kind of set that aside and moved the deck over to this machine. Now that uncovered plenty of issues with this tractor and it ran like a dog for quite a while. However, we've made a few changes and it now runs best that we've ever had it, and we'll talk more later in the video about what we had to do to this to get it to that point. However, the job for today is to fix the wear that I showed you in the first bit of video here, in the front axle where the stub axle goes into it, because obviously we've put new tyres on very recently and we don't want to be unevenly wearing these from kind of them sitting at a funny angle from the bushings in here being worn. Now Bolens did put bushings in there from the factory and we've got replacements that we think are the right size going off of kind of parts numbers and stuff like that. So hopefully these will fit. Obviously we won't know until we try them, but they should work. Now usually if we're putting bushings into things we'd like to use our hydraulic press. However, we're not fully sure how the front axle and everything goes together on one of these, and it has the PTO going through it. So as our main grass cutting tractor we don't really want to be pulling all of that apart. So what we're going to try and do is do these repairs with the front axle still on the tractor, which means we're probably going to have to go down the route of using a bolt, a big washer and making up a pressing tool to go into these bushings. But that's kind of jumping ahead a bit. The first thing we need to do is jack this up a bit more and put it on axle stands. The front end is up on axle stands now and we've taken the wheel off on this side. We're going to do one side at a time when it comes to this. So obviously to get the stub axle off we'll need to disconnect this tie rod end and then take this part off that goes on the top of the stub axle. But as you can see, this whole area is covered in grease and grass, which is the usual mix that you find all over a grass cutting tractor, which is pretty horrible to work with. So I'm just going to spray this all with degreaser and we can clean the whole area up. Something we have noticed when we took the wheels off is that wheel bearings sound quite dry. However, and there's no grease point that we can see on the outside here, so that's not very good. But obviously that would need fully taking apart, cleaning up and greasing, and we already have enough unknowns with the job we're doing, so we're not going to go asking for trouble somewhere else. So we'll leave that as a job to do for another day, but we'll write it down as something that we need to do at some point. So we'll just quickly have a clean up of this area and we'll come back to you. We've had a quick clean up and this area is looking much nicer to work with now, so that's good. And we've replaced the axle stands with more heavy duty ones that will go a bit taller, try and take the tractor off the ground a bit, because it is a bit kind of inconvenient working down here on these tractors, but we've never had one of these with a deck on it on a bench before, so that's not really an option, so this is the only way to go about it. Now when it comes to the bushings that we've got, if I put this on here, that looks to be the right inside diameter because that's nice and snug on the stub axle, but still, you know, goes on there easy enough. The issue I think that we may find, we may not, but it's looking like if there is an issue, it's the most likely one, is this flange bit. Because when we look on here, you obviously can't see any flange bit. So I'm hoping that these front axles have just been machined such that the flange is inset and therefore that sits flush with the top of the axle, or even if it's not quite flush, just so that that is kind of countersunk, as it were, because that would mean that these are actually the right bushings. In the manual it definitely said flanged bushings, but just to make sure, obviously we won't find that out till all of this is off. So first thing I'm going to do is take off the steering rod here. Well, there we are. That wasn't as smooth as I would have liked it to have been, but is what it is. That was quite tight, I think. I did see how tight it was before I tried taking it off on camera. But the next thing to do is undo this part here, which is quite... There we are. So this has got to come off to kind of ideally open this part up a bit, which should make it easier to take off. However, there is a woodruff key there, so I'm not sure it'll actually get to be that easy. I don't want to take that fully out though, so I'll kind of leave it there. There's plenty of slack in that. May need either to use this where to push that part off. I can't tell if that's working. I think it might be. Or I might have to get some sort of chisel or something to try and open that up a bit. I'll probably cut now and come back to you in a minute and see if we can get that off. It's a shame that we didn't video taking off that steering arm, because when we did, everything else below it just dropped straight out. That's the stub axle and all of the stuff to do with that, including the flange bushing on the bottom. So clearly that was loose, and the top one was in a similar state too, so clearly they are in desperate need of replacing, because they should not be loose in this casting. Now if we come over to the bench here, we have the stub axle assembly here. I don't think we've actually shown this on camera before. So on the bottom here you've got an O-ring, which I assume is just to keep the grease in. Then in there is a thrust bearing with two thrust washers, or a thrust washer either side. And then of course the bushing that came off the bottom here. With the old bushings out, we can now compare to our new ones to make sure that they are all right. And we did notice a bit of a problem, which is that the flange on our new bushings is quite a bit thicker than the old ones. Now if I put the bottom of them level, which is effectively how they would sit in the front axle, you can see that makes these bushings stick out more and effectively make the front axle part that occupies this area of the stub axle taller by effectively double the distance you see there, because there's one on the top, one on the bottom. Now we were slightly concerned by this at first, so we've done plenty of measuring, and we think that actually that should be okay with the amount of stub axle that was left over at the top. With that steering arm sitting about there, that could be moved up slightly. However, there are some positives of this sitting above where the old bushings were. One of which is that on the front axle we did notice a bit of wear on the casting from where that steering arm had kind of been rubbing. That's fine, we don't need that anymore. Rubbing on here and wearing that down a bit. Putting on a thicker flanged bushing will mean that this becomes the contact surface there, so this will get worn down, not the axle, so that's good, because these can be easily replaced, the axle can't. And another thing we noticed when we were measuring stuff up is that these thrust washers are about triple the thickness that they should be, we believe. So in theory, if we put these on and our measurements turn out to be wrong and it isn't okay having the thicker flange, in theory we can just go online, order some replacement thrust washers here, and then maybe within a week or two we could put those on and the whole assembly would be okay either way. So we can get to installing these now because we have a workaround if it doesn't work. And the method we're going to use is just get one of these nice long bolts, this bit of pipe over there, and a washer, then goes on the bushing. Then for the bottom one, which is the one we'll do first, put it up from the bottom, then on top of it you put on a pair of thick washers, then put the nut on and wind it in. Effectively that will just pull up the bottom of the bolt, and hopefully, if you line it up correctly, push the bushing into where it should be with no press or hydraulics of any kind needed. I say in theory because sometimes it doesn't go that smoothly, but we'll see how it goes. We'll get this set up on the front axle and come back to you in a minute. We've transferred our setup over to the tractor now, and it's a good excuse to use our new 1.1/8" brittle spanner that we picked up at an auto jumble recently. Quite happy with that. But we've also put some paint pen on the bolt there, just so we can see kind of how much it's moved by and if it's actually moving. Got an 1.1/8" socket on the bottom as well, so however at this angle this isn't great to work on. Feels like it's going in quite smoothly. At least using this method you get a good feel for how the bushing is going in. That's getting tight now and looks about the right area. If you look at where the paint pen mark is now, it's there. So in theory, that should be around there. We've got the first one in there now and done. You can see it down there. So now for the top one, in theory this should be easier because we can actually see it. Just give it a gentle tap to get it started. In there, in theory, you could just hit them in with a hammer, but we much prefer to use this method because you get a better feel for how it's going, and also, in theory, using a washer against the bottom of this axle should keep the bolt perpendicular to it, and therefore the bushing as well, hopefully. Now this is going to take a minute or two to wind this nut up to it, so I'll cut quickly and then come back to you to draw this in. We're now ready to tighten this all the way up now. So my cameraman's going to assist me on this one by holding that. The washer is moving about a tiny bit, but it appears to be staying relatively central, so I'm not too bothered about that until it gets near the casting. Give that a quick tap. That's better, it's staying a bit more central, I think. There we are. It's starting to get tight now. And I'm pretty happy with that. With both of those bushings in now, it's time to put this stub axle back on, and we've replaced that O-ring and oiled up the rest of the stub axle to help it go into the new bushings. So if I hold this right, I won't get covered in oil. And put this in here. And I'm going to just quickly jack this up a bit, or bring the jack up to it at least. And this way, now that's supported, so we can put this steering arm on, and the woodruff key for it first, obviously, then put this on without having to worry about holding it up as well. We have the key stock in, ready to put this steering arm back on. GTB top tip here, if you've got something like this with a key in it that you have to locate, I'd suggest doing that first and then kind of slipping the rest of it on, because then you're not trying to locate two different things at once, as it were, and the key stock is usually the harder thing to locate because of how small it is. So if I now give this a tap all round. That is pretty much there, I think. And that is then ready to have this bolt tightened back up again, and the repair to this side will be done. It is all fully installed now. We were a bit concerned about the grease nipple, but we've changed that now. And if I try this out with the steering, that moves all perfectly. That was just the bonnet clanging, nothing to do with the steering. That turns smoothly. And if I try and move this up and down, the only sound you can hear is from the bearings inside the hubs, which we already said was not today's job. But there's absolutely no movement in there, and yet it can still turn smoothly without any huge resistance. So that is a job very well done, we're going to say, on this side. Now, time is cracking on a bit now, so we obviously have this side to do. Most of that time was taken up doing the measurements and stuff, but what we now need to do is this side, which, as you can see, terrible wear compared to the no movement on the fixed side. So, to save you watching the same thing twice, and hopefully we can try and do this one a bit quicker, we are going to now change these bushings off camera, and we can directly compare between now with this much wear and in about 2 seconds time with it magically fixed. As if by magic, this wheel is back on and there isn't any play in the stub axle there. There was a small sound, which I think was, again, those wheel bearings in the hub here like the other side, but that is not the job for today. So we're very happy with how we've fixed that. That is all greased up again. And taking the wear out of those 2 points has kind of exposed the other points in the steering system that need the wear removing in future. As I said, the bearings in the hubs. Also this rod end, or these 2 rod ends, one here and one back at the quadrant, have plenty of wear in them that need taking out. And I think there is a bit of movement in the quadrant actually that probably needs taking out as well. But that is quite a long job to do all of those other steering repairs, as exhibited if you were watching my channel back in 2021 when we got our second HT23 and we went through the whole steering system and replaced pretty much every bushing, I think. I'm not sure if we did the bearings in the hubs, but we did most of the steering stuff, and that was over 2 or 3 videos. So this tractor needs that work doing at some point, but for now we're very happy with what we've done here. Now, earlier in the video we did say about this running rough earlier in the year, so we should probably give you kind of the backstory to that. Now, for quite a while this tractor has smoked kind of excessively, and we thought that it was probably just burning oil, maybe a rings problem or something like that. And you may have spotted this in a couple of our videos a while back, maybe fitting the snowplow and stuff from last winter. But then it seemed to get progressively worse and worse. And then towards the start of this cutting season on Tickover, it really wasn't running right. It was kind of bouncing off the governor, revving up, then dropping, sounding like it was going to stall, then revving back up again. Then when you increase the revs on the throttle, it seemed to sort itself out. So we were just thinking that it was the carb not adjusted right. Now these problems kind of came to a head when Dad was cutting our field at one point, and it started running rough even when the revs were up. So he kind of turned around and headed for the workshop, and before he even got there, it died and we had to tow it back. Then we spent a few days on this over the summer, not videoing it because we didn't have a clue what was wrong with it, and we just kind of wanted to fix it quickly, obviously with it being a grass cutting tractor and us being halfway through a job with it. So we went through a number of things with this, and we do actually have some of the information still up on the whiteboard. As I said, with it burning oil, one of the things we thought it might have been was rings, so we did a compression test on both sides. Up there it still says the left cylinder was 125 psi, right cylinder 130, and the manual says as long as it's above 90 should be good, so we weren't too worried about that. Test the spark, and both spark plugs were sparking and it looked like a healthy spark, so we weren't too worried about that. Next we tested the fuel system, and fuel was getting through up to the carburetor. We then did a full carburetor rebuild, put it all in the ultrasonic cleaner, and then put it back to factory settings. Made no difference, so we were a bit confused at that point. We then made up new HT leads for it, and I should say before we made up the new HT leads, it wasn't firing at all. So with a spark and fuel getting to it, we had no clue why it wouldn't fire at all. Then we put the new HT leads on and it would fire once, but then it didn't seem to have the power to fire again and actually start up. So we kind of knew that the problem was probably electrical at that point. And we had a spare coil in stock, so we thought might as well change that, see if that does the job, and it did. It was probably first turn of the key, woof, off it went. So I'm assuming, or we're assuming, that while it had a spark outside of the combustion chamber, when you put it in and under pressure, the coil didn't have or wasn't sending enough power through the HT leads to the spark plugs to actually spark properly under kind of compression and air pressure in there to ignite the fuel and start up. But as I said before, this now runs lovely, probably due to the carburetor clean and going back to factory settings. It runs better than it ever has, so that's good, and it completed the rest of the season pretty nicely. One thing else I'd like to show you while we're on the subject of this tractor and the work we're doing to it is this, which is a spreadsheet that we're kind of using for each of our tractors now for a service record. Now we actually got this from the Garden Tractor Talk forum online, and I believe this might have been made by 29 Chev Stu, but I'm not too sure. But it's got kind of 3 different sections here, or 4 different sections. We've got information about the tractor, engine information, parts, some general parts information like spark plug gap, points gap, filters, kind of service information, and then service details here. So we've got dates that we've done different things, the hour reading when we did this work, and then a description of what we've done. So now we've started doing that with a few tractors, and we've only started doing that this year. You can see the models that we've kind of done it for so far. So we're only just starting to do this, but hopefully over a few years we'll gain a good kind of service record for each of our machines. That's valuable information when you've got an old machine like this. But anyway, that's kind of the problems we've had with this tractor summed up, and the front axle bushings changed, so that's a good job done on this. But that is it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.